The fog rolled thick through Blackwater Valley on the night of November 15th, 1921, swallowing the ancient pines in a shroud of gray silence. The Trans-Oregon Express, a symbol of modern luxury and progress, lay twisted across the rails like a broken spine, its elegant passenger cars scattered in the darkness. Steam hissed from the engine's burst boiler, the only sound in a landscape that seemed to hold its breath. When the rescue party arrived at dawn, they found something that defied all logic. The train was empty, not just evacuated, empty. 127 passengers had boarded in Portland, not one remained. No bodies in the wreckage, no blood on the twisted metal, no signs of struggle or panic. Personal belongings sat undisturbed, suitcases remained latched. A child's doll gazed with glass eyes from a velvet seat. It was as if 127 souls had simply vanished into the mist. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the truths history tried to bury. The only clue lay pressed into the muddy ground beside the tracks. Deep ruts from a farm wagon, leading away from the wreckage and disappearing into the fog-shrouded forest. Someone had been there in the dark hours before dawn. Someone had taken something away. This was not just a disappearance. This was a harvest. Blackwater Valley cuts deep into the heart of Oregon's Absalom Range, like an infected wound that never heals. The ancient pines grow so thick here that sunlight barely penetrates the canopy, casting the forest floor in perpetual twilight. The Blackwater River winds through the bottom of this natural bowl, its water stained black as coffee by centuries of decaying peat, so dark you cannot see 6 inches beneath the surface. Local trappers and prospectors had been vanishing in this valley for decades before the train disaster. Men would venture in seeking beaver pelts or rumors of gold, following old Indian trails that seemed to loop back on themselves. Search parties would find abandoned camps, boots left by creek beds, rifles propped against trees with no sign of their owners. The Klamath tribes had long considered the valley cursed, calling it the place where the earth was always hungry. The nearest settlement, Barlow's Crossing, sits 12 miles east on higher ground. Its residents spoke of Blackwater in hushed tones, crossing themselves when the topic arose in conversation. They repeated the old saying like a prayer, "The valley provides for its own," though none could explain what exactly that meant. Children were warned never to follow the deer trails that led down into that green darkness. Even the mail carrier refused to enter the valley, leaving packages at the timberline. Weather seemed to behave differently here. Fog rolled in without warning, so thick it muffled sound and confused direction. Men claimed their compasses spun wildly, that voices echoed where no one was calling. The silence was not peaceful but oppressive, broken only by the crack of settling wood and the distant splash of something unseen disturbing the black water. What no one realized was that the valley had been feeding for generations, and in the heart of this silent, swallowing landscape stood a weathered farmhouse where a family had learned to read the land's appetite, to understand its needs, to serve as its faithful servants. The Foleys had made their home in this forgotten place, and over time, the valley had made them into something else entirely. The Foley farm sat in a small clearing beside the railroad tracks. 3 generations crammed into a weathered clapboard house that seemed to lean against itself for support. At first glance, they appeared to be exactly what the county records claimed. A hard-scrabble farming family scratching out a meager existence from soil that yielded little and demanded much. Silas Foley, the patriarch, was a man carved from the same dark wood as the valley itself. Tall and gaunt, with hands stained permanent brown from years of labor, he spoke in the measured cadence of someone who weighed each word before releasing it. His wife Maud moved through their home like a shadow, her eyes holding the peculiar emptiness of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. Their children, 5 boys and 3 girls, ranging from 8 to 26, shared the same hollow cheeks and watchful silence that marked the family line. The Foleys kept to themselves, venturing into Barlow's Crossing only when absolutely necessary for supplies, or to sell their occasional surplus of preserved meats and vegetables. Storekeepers noted how they always paid in exact change, never lingered for conversation, and seemed to glide rather than walk. Children hid behind their mothers' skirts when the Foley wagon rolled down Main Street, pulled by horses that moved with unnatural quiet. But what truly set the Foleys apart was their peculiar brand of faith. Silas had long ago abandoned the Methodist church of his childhood, developing instead a personal theology that blended frontier Calvinism with something far older and darker. He preached to his family about divine providence, about how God provided for the faithful through mysterious channels. He spoke often of the Iron River, the railroad that cut through their land, calling it both a test of faith and a potential blessing. According to Silas's teaching, the modern world with its steel rails and steam engines was not man's triumph, but God's instrument. The Iron River carried souls through the valley for a purpose, and those wise enough to read the signs would understand when providence demanded action. The family learned to listen for the whistle in the night, to watch for the yellow glow of lanterns cutting through the fog, to recognize the sound of metal against metal as something more than mere machinery. The youngest boy, Caleb, would later describe how his father taught them to see the railroad not as an intrusion but as a lifeline sent by divine will. When times were lean, when the root cellar grew empty and winter pressed close, Silas would stand at the window overlooking the tracks and whisper prayers that sounded more like instructions. The family would gather in the kitchen after supper, heads bowed as he reminded them that God helped those who helped themselves, and that providence often arrived wearing the mask of tragedy. They seemed like simple folk struggling to survive. The truth was far more disturbing. 11 years before the Trans-Oregon Express met its fate in Blackwater Valley, another stranger had wandered onto Foley land with maps and measuring chains. Thomas Brennan was a railroad surveyor, sent by the Oregon Central Company to chart the most efficient route through the Absalom Range. He was a methodical man, a veteran of similar projects across the West, known for his precision and his ability to work alone in remote territories. Brennan arrived in Barlow's Crossing on a September morning in 1910, his leather satchel filled with instruments and his head full of calculations. The locals warned him about the valley, about the fog that could turn a man around, about the Foleys who lived down there like something out of an old country tale. But Brennan had heard such stories before. Every remote valley had its ghosts. Every isolated family its reputation for strangeness. He spent 3 days mapping the upper ridges before descending into the valley proper. His notes from those first days were precise and professional, recording elevation changes, soil composition, the optimal grade for laying track. He noted the Foley farm in passing, describing it as a modest homestead that would require minimal acquisition costs. The family, he wrote, seemed cooperative and respectful of his work. On September 8th, Brennan's notes became erratic. His handwriting, previously neat and measured, grew wild and angular. He wrote of sounds in the forest that had no source, of the way the fog seemed to move with purpose, of how the Foley children watched him from the edge of the tree line with eyes that reflected light like animals. He complained that his compass spun wildly near certain areas of the property, that his measuring chains came up short when he rechecked his work. The final entry in Brennan's journal was dated September 10th. It consisted of a single line written in letters so pressed they tore the paper underneath. "The earth is hungry, and they know how to feed it." Search parties found Brennan 2 days later, wandering the main road 3 miles outside Barlow's Crossing. His clothes were torn, his instruments missing, his hair gone white as winter frost. He babbled incoherently about roots that moved like fingers, about voices calling from beneath the ground, about a family that smiled too wide and worked too quietly. When questioned about his location during the missing days, he could only repeat that the earth had been hungry, that he had seen the feeding, that it was not what men were meant to witness. Dr. Marcus Webb, the county physician, declared Brennan mentally unfit and arranged for his transport to the state hospital in Salem. In his admission notes, Webb attributed the surveyor's condition to prolonged isolation and exposure, a not uncommon affliction among men who worked alone in the wilderness for extended periods. The maps and notes Brennan had completed were filed away, his route recommendations ignored, in favor of a longer but more conventional path through established valleys. Sheriff Henry Hale, father of the man who would later investigate the train disaster, visited the Foley farm to ask about their interactions with the surveyor. Silas Foley received him on the front porch, calm and courteous, expressing concern for the poor man's condition. The family had offered Brennan water and a meal, Silas explained, but the surveyor had seemed agitated, muttering about things that made no sense. They had watched him work from a respectful distance, offering help when needed, saying prayers for his safe journey. The sheriff found nothing suspicious in Silas's account. The Foleys were strange, certainly, but strangeness was not a crime. The surveyor had clearly succumbed to the pressures of his solitary work, a victim of his own isolation and the valley's oppressive atmosphere. The case was closed within a week, filed under misadventure and madness. Thomas Brennan spent the remaining 15 years of his life in the state hospital, never recovering his reason, never ceasing to speak of the hungry earth and the family that served it. The doctors noted that he became particularly agitated during the autumn months, claiming he could smell the smoke of distant fires and hear the sound of metal tools working earth. They attributed these episodes to seasonal depression and the lingering trauma of his breakdown. The surveyor's madness wasn't madness at all. It was memory. And if anyone had listened, if anyone had investigated, they might have understood what was waiting in Blackwater Valley before the Iron River finally delivered its greatest gift. The Trans-Oregon Express represented everything modern about 1921 America. Pullman cars upholstered in burgundy velvet, dining compartments with crystal chandeliers, observation decks where passengers could watch the countryside roll past in comfort and style. The train promised to cut travel time between Portland and Sacramento by 8 hours, following a new route through the Cascade Range that showcased the engineering marvels of the age. Among the 127 passengers who boarded that November morning were names that would soon fill newspaper headlines across the nation. Reverend Abraham Clark, the famous evangelist whose tent revivals had drawn thousands to salvation, occupied a private compartment in the first car. His letter to his wife, found later in the wreckage, spoke of his excitement to bring the gospel to the mining camps of Northern California. "I go to bring light to the dark places," he had written, "where men have forgotten God's love." The industrialist Marcus Wellington traveled with his family in the luxury car, their compartment filled with steamer trunks and hat boxes for their winter retreat in San Francisco. His wife Eleanor had packed their finest china for the journey, planning to host dinner parties in their private dining room as the train wound through the mountains. Their daughter Margaret, only 14, carried a leather journal where she recorded her observations of the passing landscape, her final entry describing the mysterious fog that makes the trees look like ghosts. In the third car rode the Hendricks family, Ohio farmers who had sold their homestead to seek new opportunities in the California valleys. James Hendricks clutched the deed to their new property, purchased sight unseen through a land agent's promising letters. His wife Sarah watched their 3 children play in the aisle, grateful for the train's modern amenities after months of preparation for their great adventure. The train's crew took pride in their punctual service and attention to passenger comfort. Engineer Walt Morrison had piloted trains for 22 years without a serious accident, known for his ability to maintain schedule regardless of weather conditions. Conductor Samuel Hayes moved through the cars with quiet efficiency, ensuring each passenger felt welcomed and secure. The storm that would change everything began building as the train left Eugene that afternoon. Weather reports had predicted light rain, nothing unusual for November in Oregon. But as the express climbed into the mountains, the clouds thickened to an unnatural darkness. Lightning struck the forward cars with unusual frequency, as if drawn to the steel rails cutting through the wilderness. By evening, the storm had intensified beyond all forecasts. Rain hammered the windows while wind rocked the heavy cars on their suspension. Passengers gathered in the dining car for comfort, sharing stories and songs to pass the anxious hours. Children pressed their faces to the glass, watching the lightning illuminate the ancient forests in stark, momentary detail. Engineer Morrison reduced speed as they approached the Blackwater Valley section, concerned about the track conditions in the saturated soil. The railroad had cut corners in this remote stretch, laying rails on a foundation that prioritized cost over engineering standards. The company executives had reasoned that few trains would use this route during winter months, that the risk was acceptable for the savings achieved. At 10:47 that night, as the Trans-Oregon Express rounded the curve above Blackwater Valley, the weakened roadbed finally surrendered to the storm's assault. The engine lurched sideways, dragging the passenger cars into a twisted chain of wreckage that scattered across the narrow valley floor. For the passengers, it was catastrophe. For the Foleys, it was Christmas morning. The Iron River had finally delivered its greatest gift, and Silas knew that Providence demanded immediate action. The crash echoed through Blackwater Valley like thunder that refused to fade. Silas Foley stood at his kitchen window, watching the orange glow of fires flickering through the fog below. He had been waiting for this moment his entire life, praying for it through lean winters and failed harvests. The Iron River had finally overflowed its banks, and the faithful would be rewarded. Within minutes, the entire Foley household was mobilized with the quiet efficiency of a military operation. Maud gathered blankets and lanterns while the older boys hitched the horses to their largest wagon. The younger children were sent to prepare the root cellar and the butchering shed, clearing space for the bounty that Providence had delivered. No words were wasted, no time lost in discussion. They had rehearsed this moment in their prayers and their dreams. The family descended into the valley like shepherds called to a nativity, their lanterns bobbing through the darkness like benevolent spirits. They found the wreckage scattered across a quarter-mile of twisted track, passenger cars thrown at impossible angles, steam still hissing from the ruptured boiler. Survivors called out from the darkness, some trapped beneath debris, others wandering in shock through the wreckage. Silas approached each group of survivors with the practiced compassion of a country preacher. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being trusted in times of crisis. The family farm was just a short distance away, he explained, warm and dry and equipped to shelter the injured until proper rescue could arrive. The November cold was already settling into their bones, the fog growing thicker by the hour. Without immediate shelter, exposure would claim more lives than the crash itself. The passengers, grateful for any sign of human kindness in their nightmare, followed the Foleys willingly. Mothers clutched injured children as Silas guided them along forest paths, lit only by lantern light. Businessmen leaned on the strong arms of the Foley boys, thankful for their quiet competence in the chaos. Reverend Clark himself praised God for sending these good country folk to minister to the suffering. What happened next would make investigators question everything they thought they knew about human nature. The Foleys led small groups of passengers back to their farm in careful stages, never allowing the full scope of their operation to be visible to any single survivor. They spoke soothingly of medical attention waiting at the house, of hot food and warm beds, of how fortunate it was that the crash had occurred so close to people willing to help. The root cellar had been prepared with meticulous care. Its thick stone walls muffled sound completely, its heavy wooden door locked from the outside with iron hardware that had been reinforced over generations. The butchering shed, normally used for processing livestock, had been cleared and organized with the systematic precision of men who understood their work. Sharp tools hung in perfect rows. Heavy tables waited to receive their burden. Drainage channels had been carved into the floor decades earlier. By dawn, the Foley farm had been transformed into an efficient processing facility that would have impressed the stockyards of Chicago. The family worked through the night with the methodical patience of farmers bringing in a harvest, each member assigned specific tasks that maximized both speed and yield. Maud maintained careful records in the household ledger, noting quantities and portions with the same attention she gave to their regular livestock accounts. The cleaning of the crash site required equal precision. The Foleys understood that Providence was worthless if it drew unwanted attention. They removed every trace of their presence from the wreckage, collected scattered personal items that might raise questions, and ensured that when rescue parties arrived, they would find only the ghostly shell of a disaster with no clear explanation for the missing passengers. Before we go further into this darkness, I need you to understand something important. If you're still watching, if you haven't turned away, then you're ready to hear truths that most people can't bear. Hit that subscribe button because what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about the nature of evil. The most disturbing aspect of the Foley operation was not its brutality, but its righteousness. They approached their work with the calm satisfaction of people fulfilling a sacred duty, certain that they were instruments of divine will rather than architects of human tragedy. When the last lantern was extinguished and the final tool cleaned and stored, the family gathered for prayers of thanksgiving. By the time the official rescue party reached the valley the following afternoon, they found only the empty shell of the Trans-Oregon Express and a mystery that would haunt the region for generations. The Foleys watched from their kitchen window as searchers combed through the wreckage, calling out for survivors who would never answer. Silas offered the rescue team coffee and sandwiches, expressing his sorrow for the tragedy that had befallen their quiet valley. What no one realized was that the real tragedy was not the derailment. It was discovering that monsters could wear the faces of good Samaritans, that evil could disguise itself as mercy, and that the most dangerous predators were those who genuinely believed themselves to be blessed. 3 days after the Trans-Oregon Express vanished into the mists of history, Elias Thorne stepped off the morning train at Barlow's Crossing with a leather briefcase and a reputation for solving the unsolvable. The Oregon Railroad Company had sent their best investigator to determine what had happened to 127 passengers and why the largest search and rescue operation in state history had produced nothing but questions. Thorne was not a man easily satisfied with convenient explanations. At 32, he had earned his position by refusing to accept the word impossible in his reports. He had tracked down missing cargo through 3 states, exposed insurance fraud schemes that had fooled federal investigators, and once located a stolen locomotive that an entire sheriff's department had given up for lost. The mystery of the vanished passengers represented the greatest challenge of his career. His first stop was the office of Sheriff John Hale, where he found a man eager to close a case that had brought unwanted attention to his quiet county. Hale's theory was straightforward and supported by what he considered overwhelming evidence. The passengers had survived the crash, but succumbed to exposure and disorientation while attempting to walk out of the valley. The fog had confused their direction, the terrain had claimed their footing, and the wilderness had swallowed their remains. But Thorne's trained eye immediately spotted the flaws in this comfortable narrative. Where were the bodies? Even if wild animals had scattered the remains, surely some trace would have been found during the extensive search. Why had no personal effects been discovered along the supposed escape routes? Most troubling of all, why was the crash site so unnaturally clean, scrubbed of the blood and debris that should have marked such a catastrophic accident? The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Anna Briggs lived in a cabin 2 miles upstream from the Foley farm, a widow who had spent 40 years watching the comings and goings of Blackwater Valley with the sharp eyes of someone who had nothing but time and curiosity. When Thorne knocked on her door, she greeted him with the knowing smile of someone who had been expecting this conversation. Anna had seen things on the night of November 15th that had robbed her of sleep for weeks afterward. The Foley wagon had passed her cabin 6 times between midnight and dawn, always loaded heavy on the way down to the tracks, always returning empty. She had watched from her window as lanterns moved through the forest like fireflies, following paths that led directly from the crash site to the Foley farm. More disturbing were the sounds that had carried on the fog-laden air. Anna described hearing what she first thought was the lowing of cattle, but the sounds came at the wrong time and from the wrong direction. There had been the rhythmic thud of axes against wood, the scrape of metal tools on stone, and underneath it all, a sweet, smoky smell that reminded her of the rendering operations she had known in her youth. Sheriff Hale dismissed Anna's testimony with the weary patience of a man dealing with the fantasies of an isolated old woman. She was 73 years old, he explained to Thorne, living alone with only her cats for company. The valley played tricks on sound and vision, especially at night during heavy fog. What she thought she had seen was probably nothing more than the Foleys checking their livestock after the storm. But Thorne recognized the difference between confused recollection and precise observation. Anna's account was too detailed, too specific, too consistent to be dismissed as senile imagination. When he pressed her for more information, she reluctantly admitted that the sweet, smoky smell had persisted for nearly a week after the crash, hanging over the valley like an unnatural fog that seemed to rise from the Foley property itself. The investigators' first visit to the Foley farm yielded nothing but frustration and a growing sense of unease. The family received him with the same calm courtesy they had shown the rescue teams, expressing appropriate concern for the missing passengers and offering whatever assistance they could provide. Silas Foley answered every question with the measured responses of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from appearing cooperative. The farm appeared prosperous in a way that seemed inconsistent with the harsh conditions of Blackwater Valley. The root cellar was remarkably well stocked for a family that struggled with the poor soil and short growing season. Rows of preserved meats and vegetables lined the shelves, more food than Thorne would have expected to find in establishments twice the size. When questioned about this abundance, Silas credited God's providence and careful planning for their good fortune. Maud Foley moved through the house like a shadow, speaking only when directly addressed, her pale eyes never meeting Thorne's gaze directly. The children displayed the same watchful silence that marked the entire family, observing the investigator with an intensity that made him profoundly uncomfortable. There was something rehearsed about their responses, something that suggested they had prepared for exactly this type of scrutiny. But it was the absence of normal sounds that troubled Thorne most deeply. No dogs barked at his approach, no chickens clucked in the yard, no cattle lowed in the distance. The Foley farm existed in an envelope of silence that seemed to absorb sound rather than produce it. Even the wind seemed to die when it reached their property, as if the land itself was holding its breath. As Thorne prepared to leave, Silas walked him to his horse with the unhurried gait of a man secure in his innocence. The crash was a tragedy, the patriarch observed, but tragedies were tests of faith that revealed both the fragility of human life and the mysterious ways of divine providence. Some mysteries, he suggested with quiet authority, were not meant to be solved by mortal men. One old woman saw too much, and her testimony would haunt the investigation. But what Thorne didn't yet understand was that the truth he sought was hidden not in the shadows of the forest, but in the neat columns of a farmer's ledger, waiting to reveal the most chilling secret of all. Anna Briggs's testimony gnawed at Elias Thorne like a splinter that refused to heal. For 3 sleepless nights he replayed her words, analyzing every detail of his visit to the Foley farm. The investigator's instincts screamed that something fundamental was wrong with the family's carefully constructed facade of innocence. On November 23rd, Thorne returned to Sheriff Hale's office with a formal request for a search warrant. Anna Briggs represented the only witness who had observed unusual activity on the night of the disappearance. The Foley farm's proximity to the crash site, combined with witness testimony of repeated wagon trips, established probable cause for investigation. Sheriff Hale resisted with the stubborn determination of a man protecting his reputation. The Foleys were strange, certainly, but strangeness was not grounds for harassment. Any aggressive action against a local family based on such flimsy evidence would make him look like a fool if nothing was discovered. But Thorne possessed the railroad company's authority and backing of state officials who demanded answers. Political pressure had reached the governor's office, making it clear that every possible lead must be exhausted. Faced with orders from above, Hale reluctantly agreed to accompany Thorne on what he predicted would be a humiliating waste of time. The search party assembled at dawn on November 24th. Thorne, Sheriff Hale, 2 deputies, and Dr. Alistair Finch, the railroad's forensic specialist. They approached the Foley farm through morning mist, the valley watching their progress with oppressive silence. Silas Foley met them at the front gate with calm demeanor, expressing no surprise at the search warrant. Instead, he welcomed the investigators with gracious hospitality, confident in his innocence. The family had nothing to hide and everything to gain from clearing their name of suspicion. The search began with the main house, where deputies examined every room with methodical thoroughness. They found typical frontier homestead contents: simple furniture, religious books, family photographs. The children watched with unsettling silence, never speaking unless directly addressed, never showing curiosity or fear. Dr. Finch applied forensic expertise to every surface, searching for traces of blood or evidence of concealment. His examination revealed nothing beyond normal household cleaning patterns. Chemical tests detected no traces of human blood. The real focus was the root cellar that had impressed Thorne with its unusual abundance. The investigators descended, expecting to find evidence validating their suspicions. Instead, they discovered exactly what Silas had claimed: an impressive but entirely legitimate food storage operation. Row upon row of preserved vegetables filled wooden shelves clearly in use for decades. Mason jars contained pickled vegetables, their contents visible through clear glass. Barrels held salted pork and beef, properly cured and stored. Smoked hams hung from ceiling hooks with normal smoking patina. Every container was labeled in Maud's precise handwriting, noting contents and preservation dates. Dr. Finch examined samples from multiple containers, testing for irregularities that might indicate non-standard contents. His analysis revealed nothing suspicious. Preserved meats showed normal composition, and aging patterns of properly processed livestock. Even the most suspicious investigator could find no fault with the family's storage practices. The butchering shed yielded similarly disappointing results. Sharp knives for cutting meat, heavy tables scarred by years of use, drainage channels carved into wooden floors, iron hooks suspended from ceiling beams. Everything showed normal wear patterns of regular livestock processing, with no indicators of unusual or recent activity. Sheriff Hale's satisfaction grew with each negative finding. When the party had finished examining every building and corner of the property, they had found absolutely nothing to support their suspicions. Silas Foley walked the disappointed investigators back to their horses with quiet dignity. He bore no grudge against their intrusion, understanding they were doing their duty in desperate circumstances. The tragedy weighed heavily on his heart, and he continued to pray for the passengers' safe return. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had shown them preserves and pickles. The most thorough search in the county's history had produced nothing but embarrassment for investigators and vindication for a family that had endured suspicion with remarkable grace. But what none of them realized was that the evidence they sought was hidden in the mundane records of a household ledger that no one had thought to examine. The failure at the Foley farm left Elias Thorne in a professional crisis that threatened to end his career with the railroad company. His superiors in Portland had expected results, not excuses about intuition and atmospheric dread. The search had been thorough, the findings conclusive, and the embarrassment complete. Sheriff Hale made no effort to hide his satisfaction at the investigators' humiliation, suggesting that perhaps it was time for Thorne to accept that some mysteries had no earthly solutions. But Thorne possessed the kind of stubborn persistence that had made him successful in cases where others had given up. Unable to sleep, haunted by the memory of Anna Briggs's testimony and the unnatural silence of the Foley farm, he returned to his hotel room and spread every piece of evidence across his narrow bed. Photographs of the crash site, witness statements, railroad schedules, weather reports, and search records formed a paper landscape of frustration. Among the documents was a copy of the Foley household ledger that had been photographed during the search as a matter of routine procedure. Dr. Finch had dismissed it as irrelevant after a cursory examination, noting only that it contained the typical records of a farming family's domestic economy. But Thorne, driven by desperation and professional pride, began to examine the ledger with the methodical attention to detail that had built his reputation. The ledger covered 3 years of household accounts, from January 1919 through December 1921. Maud Foley's precise handwriting recorded every transaction, every purchase, every bit of income and expenditure with the meticulous care of someone managing resources that could never be wasted. For the first 2.5 years, the entries painted a picture of grinding poverty barely held at bay through careful management and occasional good fortune. But something fundamental changed in the autumn of 1921. The entries for October showed a sudden abundance that seemed to defy explanation. Where previous months had recorded careful purchases of small quantities of salt, flour, and other preserving supplies, October showed massive acquisitions that suggested preparation for an enormous preservation project. More troubling were the cryptic notations that appeared alongside the standard household entries. Beginning in late October, Maud had recorded mysterious additions to their food stores using terminology that made no sense in the context of normal farming operations. Iron River Blessing, 20 units appeared on October 30th. Providence Delivery, 15 units, was noted on November 2nd. Harvest Bounty, 47 units, dominated the entry for November 10th. Thorne's hands began to tremble as he cross-referenced these dates with the timeline of the crash. November 15th, the night of the derailment, was followed by the most significant entry in the entire ledger. Greatest blessing, 127 units preserved for winter stores. The investigator's blood turned to ice water as the numbers aligned with horrifying precision. The mysterious units that had appeared in the Foley ledger corresponded exactly to the number of passengers who had vanished from the Trans-Oregon Express. What had seemed like the careful record-keeping of a frugal household revealed itself as something far more sinister, a meticulous accounting of human lives converted into winter provisions. Further examination revealed additional layers of the family's careful planning. Entries from early November showed purchases of unprecedented quantities of salt, smoking materials, and preservation supplies. The family had somehow anticipated the need for massive food processing operations weeks before the crash occurred. Either they possessed supernatural foresight, or they had been systematically targeting previous victims whose disappearances had never been connected or investigated. The ledger's earlier mysterious entries began to make terrible sense when viewed through this new lens of understanding. The Iron River blessings of October coincided with reports of missing railroad workers who had been surveying the valley. The Providence deliveries of early November matched the disappearance of two traveling salesmen whose abandoned wagon had been found near Blackwater Valley. Every cryptic notation represented lives that had been harvested and processed with the same efficiency the family applied to their livestock. Most chilling of all were the detailed preservation records that followed each harvest entry. Maud had documented the processing methods, storage locations, and expected consumption schedules with the same precision she applied to their regular food supplies. The passengers of the Trans-Oregon Express had been reduced to inventory numbers in a household accounting system that treated human lives as just another form of providential abundance. Thorne realized that the search party had been examining the evidence they sought without understanding its significance. The impressive food stores in the root cellar, the well-equipped butchering facilities, the family's careful preservation methods, all represented a system that had been perfected through years of practice on victims whose disappearances had been dismissed as accidents or misadventures. The truth wasn't written in blood. It was written in accounting. The Foley family had maintained meticulous records of their crimes, hidden in plain sight among the mundane transactions of domestic life. What appeared to be the careful bookkeeping of a struggling farm family was actually the operational log of the most systematic serial killing operation in the history of the American frontier. But Thorne faced a devastating problem. The ledger's cryptic language could be interpreted as evidence of mass murder, but it could equally be dismissed as the eccentric record-keeping of religious people who viewed their modest prosperity as divine blessing. No court would convict a family of cannibalism based on ambiguous accounting entries and the testimony of an elderly woman who claimed to have smelled something suspicious. The investigator sat in his hotel room holding the key to the greatest mystery of his career, knowing that the truth he had discovered could never be proven in any court of law. The Foleys had committed the perfect crime, hiding their monstrous harvest behind a facade of humble piety and carefully maintained innocence. The numbers didn't lie, but they spoke in a language that only one man in the world could understand. The decision to return to the Foley farm alone came to Elias Thorne in the darkest hours before dawn, when conscience and professional duty finally overcame prudence and self-preservation. He could not live with himself knowing what he knew, could not walk away from 127 souls whose only memorial was a line in a household ledger. If the law could not touch the Foleys, perhaps moral confrontation could extract the confession that evidence could not provide. Thorne arrived at the farm as evening fog began to rise from the valley floor, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and something else. something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. The investigator had come without his badge, without his authority, carrying only the ledger and the desperate hope that evil could be shamed into admitting itself. Silas Foley answered the door as if he had been expecting this moment, his gaunt frame silhouetted against the warm light of the kitchen beyond. There was no surprise in his hollow eyes, no fear at the sight of the man who had disrupted his family's peace. Instead, there was something that might have been relief, the expression of someone who had grown weary of carrying secrets too heavy for any mortal soul. The two men sat across from each other at the kitchen table, where the Foley family had shared their meals and said their prayers. The ledger lay between them like evidence in a trial that would never be held, its pages open to the damning entries that told the story of systematic harvest. Candlelight flickered across the worn wood, casting shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent life. Thorne began with questions, but Silas Foley had no interest in denying what could no longer be hidden. The patriarch spoke with the calm certainty of a man whose faith had never wavered, even in the face of acts that would horrify the civilized world. He did not see himself as a monster, he explained, but as an instrument of divine providence, chosen to receive the gifts that the Iron River delivered to his valley. The conversation that followed would haunt Thorne for the remainder of his life. Silas spoke of lean winters when his children's ribs showed through their skin, of watching his family slowly starve while the world beyond the valley prospered in ignorance and abundance. He described the revelation that had come to him during prayer, the understanding that God provided for the faithful through channels that lesser men could not comprehend or accept. The railroad was not man's creation, Silas insisted, but divine instrument designed to deliver sustenance to those worthy of receiving it. The passengers who rode the Iron River were not victims, but offerings, their deaths serving a higher purpose than their lives ever could have achieved. They had been transformed from mere mortality into the means of survival for a family that served God's will in the forgotten corners of creation. But what disturbed Thorne most deeply was not the patriarch's justification for mass murder, but his genuine bewilderment at the investigator's horror. Silas could not understand why feeding his family should be considered evil when the alternative was watching them die of starvation. He asked Thorne directly whether the investigator would have chosen differently, whether any father worthy of the name would have allowed his children to perish when Providence had provided the means of salvation. The philosophical challenge cut deeper than Thorne had expected. Faced with the calm rationality of absolute desperation, the investigator found his moral certainties wavering. Was it truly more evil to kill strangers, to feed one's own children, than to allow those children to die in service to abstract principles of civilization? The question revealed depths of moral complexity that no law book or religious teaching had prepared him to navigate. Silas spoke of the passengers with something approaching tenderness, describing them as blessed souls who had unknowingly participated in a sacred transaction. Their deaths had been swift and merciful, he claimed, far gentler than the slow starvation that would have claimed his own family without their sacrifice. He had honored their contribution by wasting nothing, by ensuring that every portion of their gift served its intended purpose. As the night deepened, Thorne realized that he was not facing a madman or a monster, but something far more troubling, a rational human being who had made rational choices in impossible circumstances. The investigator had expected to find either insanity or depravity, conditions that could be understood and condemned. Instead, he found a mirror that reflected questions he did not want to answer about the nature of survival and the price of love. The confrontation ended when Silas observed that the investigator would never be able to prove his accusations, and that perhaps this was itself a form of divine justice, Truth that could not be spoken aloud was truth that belonged to God alone, secret knowledge that tested the faith of those who possessed it. Some mysteries, he suggested with quiet authority, were burdens that only the chosen could bear. In that moment, Thorne realized he wasn't facing a monster. He was facing a mirror. The horror was not that such evil could exist, but that it could exist within the framework of love and faith and desperate necessity that defined the human condition. The investigator left the Foley farm knowing the truth, but also knowing that the truth was too complex and too terrible for the world to bear. 54 years after Elias Thorne walked away from the Foley farm carrying secrets too heavy for any man to bear, a dying old man in a Salem hospital bed decided that some truths were too important to take to the grave. Caleb Foley, the youngest son who had watched his family's terrible harvest with the wide eyes of childhood, lay connected to machines that counted his remaining heartbeats, while a night nurse recorded his final confession. The audio recording that would finally crack open the mystery of the Trans-Oregon Express began with the rambling whispers of a man whose mind wandered between past and present like fog drifting through familiar valleys. But as Caleb's voice gained strength, his words formed a narrative that explained not just what had happened to the missing passengers, but how the Foley family had orchestrated the perfect disappearance that had baffled investigators for more than half a century. The confession revealed that the systematic slaughter Thorne had suspected was only half the story. What the investigator had never imagined was the meticulous planning that had gone into creating a false narrative that would satisfy authorities while protecting the family from suspicion. The Foleys had not simply killed the passengers and hidden the evidence. They had crafted an elaborate deception that would convince the world the passengers had vanished through natural causes. Caleb's voice grew stronger as he described the most chilling aspect of his family's operation, the careful staging of evidence that had led investigators to conclude the passengers had died wandering lost in the wilderness. After the butchering was complete, after the meat had been processed and stored, the family had spent days carrying the victims' belongings deep into the most treacherous parts of Blackwater Valley. Suitcases were opened and their contents scattered along game trails that led nowhere, creating the impression of desperate people abandoning their possessions as they struggled through impossible terrain. Clothing was torn and left hanging on thorns, suggesting the passage of disoriented survivors who had tried to push through dense undergrowth. Personal items were dropped at strategic locations to create a trail that would convince searchers the passengers had attempted to walk out of the valley. The family had studied the landscape with the eye of people who understood how authorities thought and what kind of evidence they would find convincing. They placed a woman's shoe beside a steep ravine, suggesting a fatal fall in darkness. They scattered playing cards near a bog, implying that someone had tried to mark their location. They even broke branches at human height along certain paths, creating signs of passage that would lead search parties in directions that assured nothing would ever be found. Most cunningly, they had used the passengers' own luggage to create the false trail. The family spread belongings across a dozen square miles of wilderness, always choosing locations where natural forces would eventually scatter or conceal them completely. They understood that searchers would find just enough evidence to construct a plausible narrative of tragedy, but never enough to raise questions about why no bodies were ever recovered. Caleb's confession revealed the true genius of his father's plan. Silas had recognized that the most believable disappearance was one that left traces rather than none at all. Complete absence of evidence would eventually arouse suspicion, but scattered personal effects would tell a story that investigators wanted to believe. The wilderness had claimed travelers before, and it would claim them again. Nature was the perfect scapegoat for crimes that human minds could not readily accept. The dying man described how his family had worked through several nights, hauling wagon loads of belongings into the deepest parts of the valley where even experienced hunters rarely ventured. They knew every deer trail, every hidden ravine, every patch of treacherous ground that could conceal evidence forever. The belongings were distributed with the same methodical care that the family applied to all their work, creating a pattern that would support the official conclusion without revealing the underlying design. The confession explained why the search parties had found exactly what they expected to find: enough evidence to confirm their theory of passengers lost in the wilderness, but not enough to raise uncomfortable questions about the specifics of their fate. The Foley family had written the script that investigators would follow, providing them with a narrative that satisfied both professional necessity and psychological comfort. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation in Caleb's confession was his description of how the family had watched the official search efforts, observing from hidden vantage points as teams of rescuers discovered the planted evidence and drew the conclusions that had been carefully prepared for them. The Foleys had felt no guilt at misleading the searchers, viewing their deception as a form of mercy that spared the world from truths too horrible to comprehend. As his voice began to fade, Caleb whispered the words that would haunt everyone who heard the recording. The family had not seen themselves as murderers, but as providers of a service, sparing society from the burden of knowing what desperation could drive good people to do. They had convinced themselves that their victims were better honored by being forgotten than by being remembered as food for starving children. The greatest trick the Foleys ever pulled was convincing the world that the valley itself was the murderer. They had transformed mass murder into natural tragedy, systematic killing into wilderness accident, human evil into environmental hazard. The confession revealed that the missing passengers had never been lost in Blackwater Valley. They had been found by exactly the people they needed to avoid, and their fate had been sealed the moment they accepted help from strangers who saw providence in catastrophe. Elias Thorne's final report to the Oregon Railroad Company was a masterpiece of careful omission and professional compromise. Filed on December 15, 1921, exactly 1 month after the derailment, the document officially concluded that the passengers of the Trans-Oregon Express had perished due to exposure and disorientation following their survival of the initial crash. The report cited the treacherous terrain of Blackwater Valley, the unseasonable fog that had persisted for days after the accident, and the scattered personal effects that suggested desperate attempts to find civilization. But anyone who knew how to read between the lines could detect the investigator's profound unease with his own conclusions. Thorne's language was unusually tentative for a man known for decisive findings, filled with phrases like "evidence suggests" and "circumstances indicate," rather than his typical definitive statements. The report acknowledged significant gaps in the physical evidence while maintaining that these gaps were consistent with the harsh realities of wilderness survival and the scavenging behavior of local wildlife. 3 days after submitting his report, Thorne resigned from his position with the railroad company. His official letter cited health concerns and a desire to pursue opportunities closer to his family back east. But colleagues noted that the man who returned from Blackwater Valley was fundamentally changed. Prone to long silences and sudden starts at unexpected sounds, he never spoke publicly about the case again, and his personal papers were burned upon his death in 1953. The Oregon Railroad Company accepted Thorne's findings with relief that bordered on gratitude. The alternative explanations that had been whispered in Portland boardrooms, theories involving organized banditry or mass kidnapping, would have required federal investigation and congressional hearings that could have destroyed the company's reputation and financial stability. A tragedy caused by natural forces was regrettable, but not actionable. a case that could be closed with appropriate memorial gestures and insurance settlements. Meanwhile, the Foley family entered what would prove to be their final winter of abundance. The root cellar that had impressed investigators with its legitimate food stores now contained provisions that would sustain them through the harshest months, with comfort unknown in their previous existence. But prosperity built on such foundations carried its own curse, and the family began to decay from within like fruit rotting at its core. Silas Foley lived only 2 more years after his confrontation with Thorne, dying in his sleep during the winter of 1923. His passing was attributed to heart failure, but those who prepared his body noted how gaunt he had become, as if something vital had been slowly consumed from within. Maud followed him 6 months later, found in her kitchen one morning seated at the table where she had kept her meticulous ledgers, her face peaceful but her eyes empty as winter windows. The surviving children scattered like seeds on barren ground. The older boys drifted away one by one, seeking work in logging camps and mining towns where no one knew their family name or asked uncomfortable questions about their past. The daughters married young and moved far from Blackwater Valley, taking new names and burying their memories so deep that their own children would never learn the truth of their heritage. Only Caleb remained, the youngest son who had been 8 years old during the terrible harvest of 1921. He stayed in the valley until 1947, maintaining the facade of normal farming while the property slowly crumbled around him. Neighbors noted that he never married, never seemed to age properly, and spoke to himself in voices too quiet to understand. When he finally left for the city, the Foley farm was already returning to the wilderness that had birthed it. The official story of the Trans-Oregon Express became the accepted history, repeated in newspaper articles and railroad safety manuals as an example of how quickly civilized travelers could be claimed by unforgiving terrain. The passenger manifest was filed away in company archives, the names becoming nothing more than entries in insurance ledgers and genealogical records. The families of the missing received settlement payments and death certificates that offered closure without revelation. But truth has its own persistence, and the real story of what happened in Blackwater Valley refused to die completely. Local folklore preserved fragments of the facts, transmitted through whispered conversations and cautionary tales that warned against accepting help from strangers in remote places. The valley itself began to acquire a reputation for supernatural malevolence that kept casual travelers away and preserved the family's secrets beneath layers of superstition and fear. The truth was buried deeper than any grave. It rested not in the soil of Blackwater Valley, but in the silence of a man who had seen too much and chosen to carry the weight of terrible knowledge rather than burden the world with facts too horrible to accept. For 54 years, the only memorial to 127 lost souls was the tormented conscience of an investigator who had discovered that some mysteries were solved not to provide justice, but to prove that justice itself was sometimes an inadequate response to human tragedy. The ruins of the Foley farm still draw visitors to Blackwater Valley, though few understand what they seek among crumbling foundations and overgrown cellar stones. Urban explorers arrive expecting supernatural phenomena, drawn by internet forums that have transformed human horror into tales of ghostly manifestations and cursed ground. These modern seekers report experiences echoing earlier generations. They describe oppressive silence that muffles their footsteps, fog that moves with unnatural purpose, and digital equipment behaving strangely. GPS devices spin wildly, cameras capture shadows without visible sources, and the valley seems to absorb sound before it can travel. Most disturbing are olfactory experiences persisting more than a century after the Foley family's final harvest. Hikers catch whiffs of wood smoke mixed with something sweet and cloying that makes stomachs turn. The smell appears without warning and vanishes suddenly, leaving visitors with unsettling impressions of witnessing something never meant for the living. The old farmhouse foundation has become a pilgrimage site for true crime enthusiasts who photograph the collapsed root cellar. Without knowing, they document the tomb of 127 forgotten souls. They explore butchering shed remains with excitement rather than horror, treating the site as entertainment rather than memorial. Local authorities in Barlow's Crossing have grown weary of curiosity seekers demanding access to county records and asking uncomfortable questions about events official history has explained. Elderly residents whose grandparents whispered true stories maintain studied silence when confronted by outsiders seeking validation for supernatural theories. But the valley's reputation extends beyond ghost hunters. Serious researchers studying historical disappearance patterns notice correlations suggesting the Trans-Oregon Express was not isolated. Missing persons reports from the 1910s and 20s show geographical clusters around Blackwater Valley, statistically impossible to explain through coincidence. Technology has preserved and amplified the mystery beyond original participants' imagination. Digitized archives make the story globally accessible, while genealogy websites reveal gaps in family trees where entire bloodlines vanish. The passengers exist in databases as names without graves, stories ending with departure times and ticket stubs. Social media has transformed the legend into viral content, with influencers filming themselves exploring ruins while sharing theories ranging from plausible to absurd. They speak of government cover-ups and supernatural curses missing the human tragedy at the story's heart. Their content generates millions of views from audiences hungry for mystery but unprepared for moral complexity. The most haunting modern echo comes from advanced search techniques, locating additional scattered belongings where no systematic search was conducted. Ground-penetrating radar identifies anomalies suggesting metallic objects buried deeper than natural processes could account for. But local authorities consistently deny excavation permits, perhaps understanding more than they admit. Some say if you listen closely on a quiet night in Blackwater, you can still hear the echo of a train whistle and the valley waiting for its next offering. The legend warns that hunger which consumed the Foley family transferred to the land itself, patient and eternal, ready to transform the next act of desperation into systematic horror. Strip away the folklore and ghost stories, the conspiracy theories and supernatural speculation that have accumulated over decades since November 15, 1921. Remove the internet legends and viral videos that have transformed tragedy into entertainment. What remains is a collection of facts so stark they require no embellishment to disturb the conscience. The Trans-Oregon Express derailed in Blackwater Valley during an unusually severe storm. The passenger manifest lists exactly 127 individuals who boarded in Portland with tickets for destinations they would never reach. The wreckage was discovered the following morning, empty cars and scattered belongings, but no trace of human remains. The most extensive search operation in Oregon state history was conducted over 2 weeks, involving dozens of volunteers, rescue personnel, and tracking dogs. Despite covering hundreds of square miles, searchers found no bodies, no significant blood evidence, and no clear trail indicating passenger movement after the crash. The official investigation, led by railroad investigator Elias Thorne, concluded that passengers had perished due to exposure and disorientation after attempting to walk out of the valley. Personal effects discovered throughout the wilderness supported this theory. The case was officially closed on December 15, 1921. Thorne resigned 3 days after submitting his final report. He never spoke publicly about the investigation and died in 1953, having ordered destruction of all personal papers related to the case. No explanation was ever provided. The Foley family were questioned and their property searched by law enforcement. No evidence of wrongdoing was discovered, and the family was cleared of any connection to the disappearance. Silas Foley died in 1923. His wife Maud 6 months later. Their children gradually left the valley over following decades. In 1975, Caleb Foley provided what he claimed was a deathbed confession to a Salem hospital nurse. The recording was deemed inadmissible due to questions about mental competency and lack of corroborating evidence. It was never officially investigated. The railroad tracks were removed in 1964. The Foley farm buildings were demolished in the 1980s after being condemned as unsafe. Modern searches using advanced technology have identified buried metallic anomalies, but excavation permits are consistently denied by local authorities. The passengers are memorialized on a bronze plaque at Portland Union Station, installed in 1971. Their families received death certificates and insurance settlements based on presumption of death by misadventure. These are the undisputed facts existing in government files and corporate archives, regardless of surrounding theories or legends. On November 15, 1921, 127 people boarded a train that derailed near a remote farm in Oregon. None were ever seen again. In the end, only the numbers remain: 127 souls, 0 survivors. Everything else is speculation, folklore, and questions that keep people awake, wondering what desperate circumstances might drive ordinary people to make choices that history refuses to acknowledge. The story you just heard challenges everything we think we know about the nature of evil, about survival, and about the thin line between civilization and savagery. If you found yourself questioning your own moral certainties, if these truths disturbed you in ways you didn't expect, then subscribe, because we're only just beginning to explore the shadows where history hides its most uncomfortable secrets. Today, Blackwater Valley lies peaceful beneath the Oregon sky, its dark waters flowing as they have for countless centuries, carrying secrets toward the distant sea. The railroad tracks are gone, reclaimed by forest and time. The Foley farm exists only as foundation stones, scattered among the ferns, slowly sinking into soil that has digested far more than fallen leaves and forgotten dreams. Hikers who venture into the valley speak of an unusual quiet that seems to press against their eardrums, a silence so complete it makes them conscious of their own heartbeat. They describe a landscape that feels watched, though no eyes are visible among the ancient pines. Some report finding rusted fragments of metal deep in the undergrowth, pieces too corroded to identify but somehow wrong in their placement, as if the earth itself had tried and failed to digest them completely. The memorial plaque at Portland Union Station grows tarnished with each passing year, its bronze surface darkening until the names of the passengers become difficult to read in anything but the brightest light. Commuters hurry past without stopping, their minds focused on destinations and schedules, unaware that they walk daily beside a monument to 127 souls whose journey ended in ways that official history refuses to acknowledge. But the valley remembers what the world has chosen to forget. In the deepest winter months, when fog rises from the black water and clings to the valley walls like breath on cold glass, local residents claim they can still hear echoes of something that should have ended more than a century ago. The distant whistle of a train that no longer exists, carried on wind that seems to blow from the past itself. The Iron River may be gone, but its hunger lives on in the land it once served. Some appetites, once awakened, never truly sleep. They simply wait, patient as stone, for the next desperate act to transform ordinary people into something history will refuse to remember. The valley that swallowed 127 passengers whole still lies beneath the Oregon sky, beautiful and terrible and eternally, quietly hungry.